Welcome to HOA Disasters, the channel where we expose the outrageous, the absurd, and the downright unbelievable stories from neighborhood hell. I'm Nicole, and if you've ever dealt with an HOA that went too far, you're in the right place. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because trust me, these stories only get crazier. Now, let's get started. Margaret Greaves sat at the cramped desk in her living room, the clock ticking out the last cold notes of an afternoon. Dust mingled in rays of sun that felt heavier than sunlight ever should. She spent the morning rearranging her late husband's letters, careful not to move them too far from where his hands had left them on the day he died. Every movement seemed suspended, like waiting for something she'd forgotten. Then, with a suddenness that felt like an insult, the mailbox clattered. This time, the envelope was oppressively official, white thick, and a red stamp pressed across the corner like a wound. Her name was printed in all capitals. Margaret slid it open with a kitchen knife, careful not to tear any words. The first word leapt out at her: violation. Her eyes stumbled, searching for logic, for reason. It wasn't there. The document gave an amount, $1,200, typed as if decided by some hidden dice throw. Next to it, there was only a phrase: non-regulation flower pot. No picture, no description, not even a helpful reference to a page in the bylaws. Just the accusation, demanding a sum she couldn't manage. Below, a date marked in red ink pulsed like a warning. Payment due, August 17. The formality of those lines felt like a blade wrapped in velvet. Margaret glanced to the windowsill, where a faded blue pot rested. The rim was chipped, the paint uneven, a gift her husband had chosen on their last trip together. Inside, a geranium bruised by summer heat managed 2 red blooms, both wilting at the edges. She tried to remember if she had missed a newsletter, some kind of warning, but the only things in her mailbox lately were advertisements and silent envelopes from the funeral home. Her mind raced, grasping for some sensible explanation. Was it the color, the cracks? Her neighbor's plastic flamingos had stood for 5 years without complaint. Why her, and why now? The fine included a phone number for questions. She dialed. The phone rang 8 times. No answer, no voicemail, just silence. Margaret's stomach knotted, waiting for a voice to tell her there had been a mistake, a computer error, a glitch. But the silence stayed and pressed closer. She read the bottom line again: failure to comply results in additional enforcement action. The plainness of the threat made it worse. Under that, in smaller font, a phrase: we appreciate your cooperation for the beautification of our community. It felt like someone had set fire to her living room and called it a candle. Margaret set the letter beside her mug, hands trembling. The scent of old roses and dish soap filled the room, a tender confusion. Her grief, a scab over so much noise, began to itch. Why a flower pot? Why now? And what would happen if she simply ignored it? Outside, the late sunlight shifted, pooling golden the way it used to when her husband pulled into the driveway. Margaret pressed her fingers to the windowsill, feeling every dent he'd left with his keys, and wondered how something so ordinary could suddenly become a battlefield. She pulled the flower pot closer. The memory of her husband's laugh, a sound that always felt like sunlight itself, flickered through her mind. She wouldn't hide the pot. Not yet. But what would she do, really, if the fine grew or the letters multiplied? What could any lone person do when a machine as faceless as the HOA bore down on them, demanding something as precious as grief be painted over? A siren sounded faintly in the neighborhood. Margaret's breath caught. On her kitchen table, the red deadline glared. What happens if she doesn't pay? And if she tried to fight, would anyone even listen? 2 days later, Margaret rolled the blue pot chipped rim and all into an old shopping tote, packing a folded towel around the soil so it wouldn't spill. It was heavier than she remembered. The rubber wheels squeaked as she crossed the walkway toward the community center, passing 3 houses with matching marigold planters, each blessedly untouched by fines or warnings. The parking lot was nearly empty. Light glinted from the glass doors. Inside, the HOA board was already arrayed like a jury behind 5 folding tables shoved together for formality. Margaret took a deep breath and stepped into the hush. She set the flower pot on the linoleum floor in the center of the circle, as visible as a blush. The board members barely looked up. One adjusted her necklace, another scribbled notes. Their faces were set in practiced politeness, eyes drifting anywhere but toward Margaret. She cleared her throat. For a moment, it was like trying to break through a glass wall. "I received a fine for this," Margaret said, lifting the pot just enough that dry dirt shifted in its base. Her voice cracked a little, but she pressed onward. "It was a gift from my late husband. He died last spring. A sudden movement. The man nearest her, Mr. Carr, if she remembered correctly, raised a single eyebrow. He pressed his lips tight as if to avoid smiling, but the upturned corners broke through. A slow, deliberate smirk. Across the table, the board president, Nell O'Brien, hinged forward. She didn't look at the pot at all. "We're here to maintain standards for the benefit of everyone," Janelle said. Her voice rang with boredom, dressed as concern. "The bylaws are clear. Non-regulation items affect property values." Margaret set her jaw. The ache was old, but the anger was new. "But what specifically is the violation? The color, the shape? Can I see the regulation?" Janelle clicked her pen. "The board has already reviewed this, Mrs. Greaves. The decision stands. If you'd like to appeal, you can submit Form 26B. Margaret looked at the other faces, searching for a flicker of empathy, a crease of uncertainty. Nothing. The man with the smirk leaned back, crossing his arms, eyes shining with private amusement. A woman in the back, she wore a tennis visor indoors, glanced quickly at her phone, bored. No one asked about her husband. No condolences. Not even the awkward basics. A motion was made, all in favor of upholding the fine. Hands went up immediately, like a reflex. 20 seconds, maybe less. The vote was unanimous. Margaret's heart thudded. The board secretary typed something, and the meeting moved on to shrub height and pool fobs. No one looked at the pot. She gathered it back into her tote, feeling the weight of everything unspoken. Eyes prickled at her from the edge of the room, some curious, some anxious to look away. On her way out, Margaret nearly bumped into the smirking man again near the coffee urn. He leaned in, just enough so the others couldn't hear, and whispered, "Welcome to the neighborhood, Mrs. Greaves." On the walk back, the pot felt heavier. The red blooms shivered in the wind. Margaret couldn't tell if it was the chill in the air or something else entirely that made her shiver too. She reached her front steps and stopped, unable to carry the pot inside right away. The sky was burning coral above her. She stared up, wondering how small acts could change the entire course of a day. Whether anyone else could see what had just happened, or if they'd care. As dusk settled, she realized the board hadn't returned the pot to her properly. In their hurry to ignore, they'd forgotten it entirely, as if pretending her pain away was as simple as looking the other direction. But Margaret couldn't pretend. And when she closed her door that night, she left the board's packet unopened on the hall table, feeling something dangerous pulse in her chest, something warm, something that didn't want to die quietly. But could one woman's defiance matter against so much practiced indifference? Night brought a strange silence to Margaret's home. The refrigerator hummed nearby, but otherwise, the rooms felt soft, as though wrapped in cotton. Her husband's absence pressed heavier now, filling the air between the kitchen and the living room. She sat at her round table, the one with the watermarks he never stopped teasing her about, hands gripping a worn mug. The HOA letter lay unopened next to a thick stack of paint brochures she'd found under the stairs while looking for paperwork the day before. Paint samples were not in her plans, not at first, but the small catalog of colors drew her, a tantalizing possibility flickering between the layers of shock. Pastels, beiges, but then a stripe of color so blinding it nearly glowed. Neon pink, hot and insolent. Her thumb slid over the square, gentler than expected. The word UV Blast Rose sat underneath, in a typeface that dared you to be embarrassed by it. She tried to picture her little house, tan stucco, black trim, reborn in this shade. Her husband's voice echoed in memory. "If you're going to make a statement, make sure they hear you from Mars, sweet Pia." Grief was a heavy blanket, but something sharper was slipping through the gaps. There were consequences to think about, neighbors, more fines, becoming the next story passed around in whispers and side glances down the block. Margaret stood up, leaving the mug rocking on the table. She never much cared what people thought before, but the injustice stung. The board had laughed at her pain, dismissed her as if the loss was an inconvenience. She let herself imagine pink paint blazing in the morning sun, impossible to ignore. The HOA forced to swallow their own medicine. All that talk about non-regulation turned inside out. She paced to the garage, slippers brushing chipped tiles. Boxes lined the wall, each with his handwriting on the side: Christmas, tools, garden. She hesitated, then dragged the ladder out with a clang that echoed. A list started forming in her mind. Not what she might lose, but what she wished someone had done for her before. What would happen if one person just didn't give in? She found her old phone, shaking as she scrolled for a local painter. Her son's prank number from April Fool's Day popped up first. "Don't even think about it, Mom," he'd texted last spring. He lived 2 states away now. She wouldn't involve him in this. Her finger hovered over the painter's number. She pressed call. Her voice surprised her own ears, steady, almost cheerful. "How early could you start?" she asked. "I have a house, standard size. I need it bright, unmistakable." There was a pause on the other end. And then, "Tomorrow, if you're ready." She agreed, almost without thinking, and hung up, a smile ghosting over her lips. She didn't tell anyone. Not the neighbor with the tiny terrier, not her church group chat, not even her own son. That night, she placed the neon sample card against the wall above her bed. It glowed in the dimness, a silent promise. But she couldn't shake a new question. If she did this, what would they do next? And more, what would she become if she swallowed that fear and did it anyway? Midnight crept by, the world outside silent, except for the distant roar of a passing car. Would the board even care? Would they retaliate? Or could one flash of color shift everything? Margaret turned out the light, but left the paint sample by the window, watching it catch the first blue hints of dawn. She didn't know if she was brave or reckless, only that tomorrow, her life, her house, would never look the same. She closed her eyes, the faint ache of anticipation outpacing even the grief. But was she truly ready for what would follow? At exactly 5:55 a.m., Margaret sat on her porch, wrapped in her crocheted blanket, mug warming her hands. The slap of rubber tires against the curb broke the dawn hush. 2 white vans backed into her driveway, their headlights blazing across dew-wet grass. The quiet of sunrise was peeled back by the creak of ladders, the shuffle of canvas drop cloths. 4 painters spilled out, their breath turning to mist in the pale light. Margaret rose, the blanket loosening on her shoulders, and nodded to the foreman. He placed his hand over his heart with a half smile, as if to say, "Are you sure?" She simply handed him the paint cans. UV Blast rose in all its aggressive, luminous glory. As the first strip of pink hit the stucco, Margaret's heart jumped. Her neighbor's windows were pinpricks in the darkness, curtains pressed close, but not quite closed. It was impossible not to feel watched, but she held her head high. If they wanted a show, she would not give them shame. A door opened across the street, fast, then snapped shut. Faint from behind the glass, a child's voice asked, "What's she doing?" An adult hush followed. 2 sets of blinds flexed just enough for silhouettes to peer through. Margaret smiled, thinking they'd have to work overtime to miss this. She wandered down the walk, saw a flash. A resident with a phone snapped a picture from between gardenias. Another did it bolder, standing in a bathrobe and clicking a dozen shots before retreating. Margaret made mental note. Nothing here was secret. The scent of fresh paint began to swallow up the old dust and cut grass. It was almost delightful. A third neighbor, the one with the bitter mouth and always perfect roses, was on the phone. Margaret heard, "Yes, right now. Of course I have to report it." Yes, the hotline. Margaret poured lemonade into little paper cups, brought them to the painters, who grinned at the pink splatters on their knuckles. Somehow, her fear shrank with every brush stroke splashed across her walls. She gave one of the painters, Mario, the largest cup, and he raised it in a silent toast. She half expected a car to screech up, for someone from the board to come running, clipboards blazing, but only the chorus of wariness pressed down, held tight behind front doors. As the pink overtook the beige, the world outside seemed to lean in. The workers joked among themselves, someone singing a song in Spanish about La Casa Más Brillante, the brightest house. Margaret giggled, a sound she hadn't made since before her husband passed. It felt like breaking a rule far older than any HOA bylaw. Halfway through, as paint shimmered in the new sun, her neighbor's terrier broke loose, bounding into her yard. Its owner, a young man named Derek, rushed out, cheeks red. "She's brave," Derek said, uncertain if he meant the dog or Margaret. "Let's hope the color's contagious," Margaret replied, handing him a cup of lemonade. By noon, the house radiated like a lantern in the desert, impossible to avoid, impossible to ignore. But of all the dozens who gawked, not one came close to ask why. Margaret sat with her back to the wall, sun dazzling on the new color, an uneasy question forming as the paint dried. What reaction would come when the sun set and the whole neighborhood had seen? Would the board knock on her door, or would they escalate in ways she couldn't see coming? The next morning, the mailbox snapped shut with a report like a slamming book. This envelope was bright as a warning light. Margaret tore it open, standing on the porch ringed in neon brilliance. This time, the violation notice was 3 pages. Words underlined, threats implied. Color palette exceeds permissible reflectivity. Fine doubled. Removal demanded. Deadline slashed a week shorter. But Margaret was prepared. She flipped through the bylaws, eyes scouting the text for ammunition. There it was, hidden between sections about roofing materials and annual dues, a single sentence. Color restrictions do not apply to external paint unless affecting adjacent properties by runoff or physical encroachment. A loophole fit for daylight. Margaret typed the text into her phone word for word. She posted it online in the neighborhood Facebook group, captioned it with a photo of her house beaming against a gray sky. Within hours, the post spread. Comments multiplied, some outraged, some delighted. The pure audacity of bright pink in a row of tan houses drew the internet's quirky affection. Photos bounced through local news blogs, then wider. Memes appeared Margaret, Queen of Pink, in a pixelated crown. But as comedy overtook condemnation, Margaret could sense the board shifting. Their second notice was less official, tone clipped, paper thin, emphasis on decorum. Murmurs began everywhere. Someone drove by slowly, windows lowered, phone rolled up. Local reporters called, asking for interviews. But with every share of the viral bylaw screenshot, Margaret's story became something larger. Neighbors, previously silent, sent sympathy emails, shared their own petty battles with the board. Others, emboldened, started looking up their own copies of the rules. The board's next move was to threaten future policy adjustments. But Twitter users immediately mocked their legalese, and the neighborhood group swelled with support. Margaret didn't leave her house for the rest of the day. She could feel the power shifting. Instead of shame, she felt the spark of rebellion, now multiplied. The original slight no longer able to hide. Yet above all the noise, a question hung, snagging her every time she logged off. Would the HOA back down? Or would they sharpen their teeth even more, twisting new rules to get around their own loopholes? And if the fight was this bold now, how much uglier could it get? A week passed, and what began as a joke mutated into a revolution. One morning, Margaret stood in her doorway and saw Olivia from 412 stringing rainbow lights across her porch railing. No holiday, no pretense, just gleaming defiance. That's not in the bylaws either, Olivia said, winking. Rumors flew down the block. Mr. Grant, a retired Army captain known for his stoic routines, painted his garage door emerald green and stenciled yellow stars across it. Neighbors took selfies, as if next to a street mural. In quiet, Charlotte Nguyen planted 6 plastic flamingos under her crepe myrtles. There's no animal restriction on decorative poultry, she scribbled on a paper sign. Gardens turned wild with color. Driveways bloomed in sidewalk chalk, hopscotch boards, and sunbursts stretching over concrete. What had been a row of careful sameness became a kaleidoscope, each resident gently testing how far rules could bend before they broke. For some, it was the first time in years their yards reflected anything about them at all. Cars slowed at each house to gawk. Some honked, some snapped photos. A sense of daring laced the early morning air, mixed with laughter and more than a little nerves. The HOA hotline was overloaded by noon, the line ringing off the hook. Reports were filed, then rescinded by neighbors who decided to side with the rebels. Margaret watched from her glowing pink windows, heart tight with pride and apprehension. For once, she felt less like an island, more like the pulse of hidden solidarity. But it wasn't all unity. Threats showed up in new ways. Anonymous notes slipped under windshields, scowls at mailboxes. Yet even the angriest voices hesitated, uncertain in the new, chaotic current. One evening, as Margaret watered her geranium, Derek approached, a wary grin breaking through. "Never seen the street so alive, Mrs. Greaves." Margaret nodded, a spark in her chest. But as colors multiplied, so did the rumor that the board was planning something strict and sudden new policies, new inspections, ways to tighten the leash. How far would solidarity take them if the other side started to fight on a different level? And if rebellion could be pretty, could it ever be safe? It didn't take long. The next Monday, a thick envelope appeared, stamped not with a fine, but with dread. Temporary emergency restrictions, effective immediately. The board had voted overnight. Porch lights were now limited to neutral tones. Decorative items required approval through a new fast-track application. The words bristled with legal jargon. Most chilling, sit-down inspections would begin on Thursday. Neighbors gathered in clusters at mailboxes, reading and rereading. Some ripped the notices. Others photocopied them for the community group online. Margaret felt the old cold return to her stomach. She walked the boundary of her property, inspecting her newly pink fortress, then stopped dead at the back fence. Pinned there, flapping in the morning breeze, was a new notice. Not in an envelope, not delivered by hand or mail or the postal worker she'd chatted with for years. Just a single sheet tacked to the wood, words typed out on printer paper. No color, no seal, violation, inspection pending. But this time, there was no signature, just a typed HOA enforcement at the bottom. No way to know who'd put it there or how long it had lingered before she found it. It felt colder, meaner. Margaret's hands shook as she pulled it down. It left a ragged wound in the grain of the wood. Inside, she discovered similar notes had appeared in Olivia's mailbox and in the flowerbed at Charlotte, some already rain-soaked, the words leaking. No official record. All intimidation. Night fell fast that day, and Margaret dreamed of her house folding inward, the color fading, leaving only the emptiness beneath. If the board was willing to break their own rules, what else would they risk? Would the neighbors stand beside her once the retaliation got personal, once it left the category of policy and entered the world of threats? As the wind battered the new paint, Margaret pressed the unsigned notice to the trash. heart thudding with questions. She was suddenly scared, even to think. Some battles, she realized, weren't meant to be fair. But just how low would the other side be willing to sink? 3 days after the inspection threat, Margaret awoke to something sharp below her door. The envelope was small, nondescript, no address or return stamp, just a single cartoon sticker of an owl pressed to the flap. Inside, there was no letter, no accusation, just a glossy photo shot from far away. Her mailbox, slightly rusted and crooked, was perfectly centered. Margaret stared at it, gripping it hard enough that the edge bit into her palm. Who had taken it, and when? Did they wait in a car or walk by at night? Were they watching to see her reaction now? She looked out the window, heart trembling with a kind of fear she hadn't felt since widowed nights alone. Neighbors passed by, some waving, some heads tucked down. She tried to convince herself it was a cruel prank, but the owl sticker nagged at her. There wasn't a child on this block who would do something so careful, owl eyes staring right back at hers. Margaret called the non-emergency police line. They listened politely, offered to send a patrol car by for presents, but warned there was little they could do without a direct threat. She thanked them, but felt smaller for having asked. That evening, as shadows grew long and the neon house glowed against dusk, Margaret slid the photo and envelope into a drawer. She felt watched, even inside her own skin. Questions multiplied. Was this from the board, or someone else entirely? Was it a signal to back down, or an omen that escalation was just beginning? She left her porch light on all night, conscious now that even the glowing pink walls weren't a shield, only a signal. As she lay in bed, listening to every click and hum, she wondered how many others had received their own silent warnings. And what would happen if she answered the threat with nothing but more color and stubborn kindness? Was bravery enough when someone wanted you to be truly, utterly afraid? Rumors spread, sticky as honey. Olivia's forum post, the flamingo front, lit up the neighborhood. Messages poured in, tales of fines for mailbox flags, threats over garden gnomes, all new fuel for the fire. Late that evening, Margaret followed the glow of cell phone screens to Derek's garage, where 10 neighbors leaned over lawn chairs, whispering. "We need each other," Charlotte said, knitting needles tapping together. Mr. Grant offered his carnet from years ago. If we don't organize, we lose. Within hours, a web of backyards became the new meeting hall. Kids guarded fences. Grandparents brought cookies and stories, some funnier than the last. They pooled copies of the bylaws, patching together the holes none of them ever noticed before. A teenager named Nico, Charlotte's oldest, launched a private chat forum. The first night, so many people logged and the site crashed twice, befuddling the board's tech volunteer. Margaret laughed for the first time in weeks. She watched solidarity spread, all colors and accents, People who'd never met except to trade mail misdeliveries, now plotting strategy while passing lemonade. Grievances became confessions. A resident fined for wind chimes, another for a Halloween doormat. The small wounds built a common cause, stronger than suspicion. But with every surge of hope, new warnings rippled out anonymous emails, gossip that the board was hiring security or running background checks. The lines between neighbor and enforcer blurred. For each act of chaos, another spark of courage, planters turned into protest murals. Christmas lights hung early in spiky, brilliant defiance. Yet as they scrawled their battle plan, recall, petition, resistance, Margaret sensed a turning. Could the wolves dressed in office casual really be overthrown? And even if they won, what old secrets might surface in the fight ahead? On Tuesday, nobody saw board member Ashford at the mailbox. For 7 years, he jogged at 7:02 a.m. sharp today. Emptiness. His mailbox bursting with flyers. By noon, his resignation letter hit every inbox. Unforeseen personal reasons. Effective immediately. Residents called his cell. The line rang in circles. The bored voice on his old voicemail now replaced by a mechanical, disconnected click. Rumors swirled someone had seen Ashford at the clubhouse at midnight, rifling through files, shoving folders into a battered backpack. The guard waved him out. After that, silence. The empty seat on the board was more than vacancy. It was evidence, proof that even the most confident could be rattled by what was coming. Margaret found her nerves dancing between relief and dread. That kind of shake-up could mean weakness or the start of something darker. Was Ashford fleeing the chaos, or something specific in his own files? What did he see digging through those records at night? What quiet rot might the board be hiding in plain sight? Neighbors wrote lists, tallying each odd occurrence since the rebellion started. When Margaret sat on her neon-painted porch that evening, she watched every car that passed, every linger at the curb. If even the board could fracture, what would happen if the rest of the power structure started to peel away? And what, exactly, had driven Ashford to run? A week after Ashford disappeared, Margaret jolted awake at 2:11 a.m. The phone glowed, unknown number, no message. She let it ring until the last moment, then pressed answer, not trusting her own voice. A crackle, then a quiet, shaky woman's voice. Pink, the paint. You know it's not the first time. Margaret's skin prickled. What do you mean? It was another house. 27 years ago. Widow. After her husband died, she fought them too. Her name was Edith Jameson. The name landed with a thud in Margaret's chest. The voice went on. They fined and fined until her lights went out. She disappeared overnight, and no one filed a missing persons. A hush followed, as though the line itself was afraid. Check the records. Look for where the fines stop. Ask about the paint. A dial tone sliced the stillness. Margaret's hands shook as she scribbled Edith Jameson. 27 years. Pink. She barely slept at all, memories spinning like autumn leaves. The bylaw had a history, a darkness that stretched longer than her own grief. The HOA had hidden more than fines behind polite smiles. Margaret imagined Edith, alone, fighting the same machinery, erased quietly when her story no longer fit. Was her house really that powerful a symbol? Or was there something more dangerous in the roots of the board, something they'd do anything to keep buried? Margaret flipped on every light in the house, the color now a beacon and a warning. Would she become the next name erased if she didn't find out the rest? As autumn pressed in, momentum escalated. Olivia led a parade down the block, clipboard in hand, signatures on paper curling up in the wind. Nearly every household signed, even those who never joined before. Within 3 days, the petition for a recall of the entire board crossed 100 signatures. The buzz was everywhere, in the post office, gym, grocery, whispered behind closed blinds. Margaret's home became command central. Pages tacked on kitchen cabinets, her old calendar rewritten with names. Neighbors came in shifts, counting each new supporter. Then, the night before the count, a pop and glow outside. Margaret rushed out barefoot. Her mailbox was caught in a strange orange blaze, plastic bubbling, paint crackling. The old blue flower pot lay beside it, unburnt but toppled. Neighbors ran with hoses. Flames sputtered out, leaving scorched earth. Amid the ashes, the remnants of the petition's envelope shimmered, edges browned. No one saw anyone running. The street cameras, old and largely broken, caught only vague shapes fleeing on bicycles. The air was thick with accusation and panic. Some neighbors wanted to call everything off, certain it was proof the fight had gone too far. Others stood firm. Charlotte arrived with a fresh batch of signatures and cupcakes, determined not to let fear dictate the outcome. Margaret stared at her blackened mailbox, heart bruised by the violence. Yet, even as she swept the sidewalk, determination burned sharper than fear. Whoever wanted to silence her had gotten bolder. But how desperate would they become before the reckoning? The day of the recall, the street was tense, electric as a drawn bow. Neighbors in lawn chairs lined the curb, pink ribbons in their hair and on their pets. Journalists snapped photos, the pink uprising trending again in local news. Inside the community gym, ballots were cast. Each vote, a stone tossed at the years of quiet, accumulating control. Margaret didn't raise her hand when it came time to nominate a new board. She was content to watch, clutching the blue ceramic pot in her lap like a relic. When the results were read, the noise was thunder. All board members were voted out by margins too wide to contest. For the first time, the power structure buckled and gave way. People hugged, some wept, others cheered until their voices cracked. Margaret stepped onto her porch, the flower pot cradled in her palms. She gazed at the garden where her husband's memory still lingered, at the neon walls bright in a slate sky. Slowly she crouched, considering the place on the windowsill where the pot once lived. But she didn't set it down. Something unfinished fluttered in her chest, the last loose thread. She watched the street, waiting, half expecting another envelope, another test. Justice had come, but not completely. She sat down, the pot in her hands, gaze fixed on the road. Would an apology ever arrive? Would the full story of Edith Jameson be revealed? Who, really, had sent the photo? What secrets still waited behind pink walls and broken bylaws? Margaret waited quietly for the next knock, knowing that every victory leaves its own open questions. Sometimes, justice means learning to wait for the letter that never comes. If this story moved you, share it. And don't forget to subscribe for more real stories where justice, courage, and community collide. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a moment where the little guy stands tall. We'll see you in the next one.